This is a project I've been working on that I'm calling a Model Society, or AMS. AMS is a project designed to explore psychological and sociological topics in a unique video game format. I became interested in the Ocean model of personality, and while reading about it, thought about how I might merge it with my interest in video game development in some way. I thought how it would be interesting to quantify personality traits and model or role-play social interaction in a game, but this quickly led to the need to include emotional states and behavior in order to accurately demonstrate how these personality traits express themselves in the real world. Behavior can be a complex topic in a game, so I decided to base the behavior on motivation or individual needs and interests. The basic elements of AMS include individuals, environment or resources, visualization of relationships, and player input through a self-rating system and quizzes designed to establish an objective player profile in terms of personality. Let's start with individuals, or NPCs. The personality is based on an expanded Ocean model of personality. There's openness with 6 subtraits, conscientiousness with 6 subtraits, extroversion with the subtraits, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Let's take a look at this graphic of the Ocean model. You can see at the top openness, and it's related to imagination, feelings, actions, ideas. When you score very low, you are more practical, conventional, and you prefer routine. If you score very high, you might be more curious, with a wide range of interests and very independent. Next is conscientiousness, and that's associated with competence, self-discipline, thoughtfulness, and being goal-driven. On the low end of that, you might be impulsive, careless, and disorganized. On the high end of that, you might be hardworking, dependable, and organized. Then is extroversion. That's associated with sociability, assertiveness, emotional expression, and on the low end, you might be very quiet or withdrawn, reserved, and on the high end, you might be outgoing, warm, and someone who seeks adventure. Then there's agreeableness, and that's associated with being cooperative, trustworthy, good-natured. On the low end, you're very critical, uncooperative, suspicious. On the high end, you can be helpful, trusting, and empathetic. Last is neuroticism. That's associated with a tendency toward unstable emotions. So on this one, on the low end, you're calm, even-tempered, and secure, but on the high end, you're anxious, unhappy, and prone to negative emotions. So that one's a little flipped if you think about it in some ways. As you can see in AMS, you can select the individuals you want to inspect and dig into, and then you can go through each one of their traits and subtraits and see where they score on that. You can also look at their emotional state. AMS uses the PAD model of emotion. PAD stands for pleasure, arousal, and dominance, and your emotional state is defined at the intersection of those traits in kind of a 3D model. If you take a look at this graph, you'll see that happiness and anger exist almost at the same plane, but at opposite ends of the pleasure spectrum. One interesting thing to this is that someone who's very low on the dominance scale may be very dependent, and that comes in later when we talk about how these NPCs, these individuals, interact, and if they can form mini cults based on somebody's sense of dominance over others, and the other people's respect of that dominance. And that ties into the next section, the motivation, the behavior piece. The motivation is based on the ERG model of motivation. This is basically a distilled version of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which you can see in this graph. The E is for your existence, your basic needs. The R is for relatedness or your social needs. And G is for growth, your personal growth, developing as a person, pursuing interests, improving on yourself, those kinds of things. In the design of this project, each NPC's behavior is dictated by a behavior tree that relies on utility theory to decide what action to take. Utility theory is really key to this. You can see a very basic description of how it's utilized in the graph that on the screen, but it basically compares competing interests in order to prioritize an action when it's used in this project. It takes a range of data and compares it against a curve on a graph. You can define the curve however you want, and whichever one has the highest value when it's evaluated along that curve wins, and the NPC pursues that. So if the person is more hungry than they are interested in socializing, they will go to a burger joint rather than a barbershop. The barbershop is where they go to socialize. The burger joint is where they go to eat. Now, as you go into the other areas of ERG, into the growth area, you start to incorporate interests. And same is true for the relatedness as well. NPCs will go to a place that is associated with an interest to socialize over a place that is not associated with an interest. So if the NPC has an interest in literature, they will seek socialization at the library rather than the barbershop. So each NPC has a list of interests, which is used to determine where to go when they socialize and where to go to pursue personal growth tasks, etc. When they socialize, they form relationships. Each NPC has various types of relationships, which are created and changed based on actions taken during the simulation. So when an NPC interacts with another NPC, they compare their profiles, basically. They compare all of those ocean values, they compare their interests, and they decide whether or not they like each other, or to what degree they like or dislike each other. The relationships are depicted on the screen in the form of lines. Strong blue lines are healthy, strong, positive relationships, whereas thin red lines are weakly negative relationships. These interactions do impact each NPC's mood, their emotional state, their pad values. Those are represented as spheres, where a large blue sphere is someone who's very happy, and a very small red sphere is someone who's sad. I've worked a great deal at how to depict these things, these relationships, these emotional states, and their motivation, their behavior. And very recently just made it so that the character will bend forward if they are not happy, and they will look up into the sky if they are very happy. Though kind of the whole point of this is to abstractly illustrate personality, emotional states, basic motivation and behavior, as well as relationships. These are not necessarily designs that are final. They're just temporary, how I'm visualizing things as I go along and create the infrastructure of the game. So to wrap up the interaction, if two NPCs meet and they don't really have a lot in common, one might slightly insult the other one, which will make the other person feel a little bit worse. And whereas if they run into each other and they have a lot in common, one will compliment the other, and they will their moods will increase, and they will form a stronger positive relationship. To me, this is a really fascinating topic, because basically the science that I've read, the empirical research, says that you like people who are more like you. But I wonder if that is dependent on certain personality characteristics. It's dependent on your mood. There's a lot of other questions that come up when we talk about evaluating kind of our affinity for one another. Let's move on to environment. The game environment consists mainly of resources, represented as buildings, which provide locations to meet the needs of the NPCs. For example, the NPC will return home to sleep, go to a restaurant to eat, go to a barbershop to socialize, go to a library to pursue an interest in literature, or go to a counseling center to determine what pursuit they should prioritize. Each building can represent multiple resources, be a hub for various interests, have a limited capacity, etc. I think this is of particular interest because in the future I would like to create an element of this game that is more like a real-time strategy game, where you are trying to manage resources in order to maximize the society that you're designing. But right now, I'm really just focused on creating a game where players can model their character based off of themselves, and these quizzes that provide an objective look at yourself, and then run a simulation to see what kind of other, character or person with various interests appeals to that representation of yourself. I would also like to use this as a tool to teach basic coping strategies, social skills, things like that that might come up in these simulations that could be useful to teenagers and people with disabilities, autism spectrum disorders, etc. And the way I'm designing it is that players can create different actions to take toward other players, and the game can evolve rather quickly by doing that. You can say, okay, I'm going to say this thing. It's a little bit negative in this sense, like it's critical of this person's whatever trait, but it's really complimentary of this other interest, and we'll see how that plays out. As we pointed out earlier, you can inspect the world. You can, take a real deep dive look at each individual NPC to see what the milieu looks like. But you can also pause it, stop time, speed it up, slow it down, do all sorts of things while you're exploring the world. Though a lot of groundwork has already been done on this project, I've learned a lot just in designing this beginning of it, and I know that I need to go back and redesign certain elements of the game to make it more customizable, to make it more scalable, things like that. And eventually, this project, A Model Society, will be a fun way to explore sociological and psychological factors based on researched principles. A Model Society will allow players to interact with these NPCs, change the game environment, observe the impact of their customized actions, and more.